I'm Amber Duke,
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. And a quick reminder that NatCon 5 is going to be held right here in Washington, D.C., September 2nd through 4th. You can sign up at nationalconservatism.org. It's the conservative event of the year. A lot of the speakers have been announced so far. It looks like it's going to be an awesome event. So definitely don't miss that. Nationalconservatism.org to get your tickets. Today we have a great roundup of topics per usual. Inez is going to kick us off with Scotus's ruling on Trump being able to do mass layoffs at the Department of Education. Will is going to walk us through the latest Department of Justice drama related to the Epstein files and apparent fights between Pam Bondi and Dan Bongino. I will give the layout of the $9, almost 10 trillion billion dollar rescissions bill making its way through Congress. And then Ben will close us out with the latest details of the Biden autopen scandal. So with that, I will kick it to Inez to start us off.
Thanks, Amber. So another good move from the Supreme Court coming down on Monday this week. So this is in yet another case of lower court justices, judges out of their skis. And this was a particularly egregious example because in this case, this judge from Massachusetts actually forced or put in an order to force the Trump administration to rehire almost 1,400 employees who had been laid off pursuant to first a Trump EO, and then this is from back in March. So essentially, there was that signing ceremony. If you remember, we discussed it on this program with the Trump EO that directed the Secretary of Education to take all legal steps towards reducing and closing the Department of Education. So this is the litigation that has popped up because, of course, it was immediately sued after that. And this has been the conclusion. So we haven't gotten to the merits like a lot of these. This is the emergency docket of the Supreme Court. So the merits of this are not actually reaching the court yet, but the opinion the court issued is very perfunctory, unsigned opinion, basically saying no, a federal court judge cannot reinstate employees that the president doesn't want working for the executive branch. And the bulk of this opinion is the dissent of the three liberal justices authored by Sotomayor, 19-page opinion, basically laying out, actually, I think some boundaries that make sense, but then just wrongly applying them to the particulars of the case. I'm being fair here because I want to note that Sotomayor, actually in the previous case that we discussed that had similar contours to this one, she left Justice Jackson out on her own with that like dissent that did not connect to any aspect of the law, right, on whether or not lower court judges could assert their power in this way. So she has split her votes between those two cases, and she explains why in this dissenting opinion. So I want to give her the respect of pointing that out. So this really comes down to whether or not the president controls the executive branch. As I keep saying week after week here, there are going to be a whole series of cases, each one of them with a different posture, depending on the structure of the agency in question, right? So how Congress has either line appropriated different programs and granted the power of running them to a particular agency, how Congress has laid out instructions for how to remove certain boards or certain people, right? So all of those things are going to go first through the interpretation of the Congress, what Congress meant to do through the courts, and then also whether or not it's constitutional for Congress to interfere so substantially in the way that the control the president ought to have over his own personnel in the executive branch. So these really are separation of powers cases. They're extremely important separation of powers cases, I would say, for, and I know I'm repeating myself week after week here, but I do think this is going to be one of the Trump administration's greatest accomplishments if they actually succeed through these cases, these different cases that are winding their way through the courts in restoring the separation of powers, restoring some semblance of a unitary executive, restoring so much more of the constitutional design that has just been out the window for decade after decade as unelected bureaucrats in agencies have been granted so much power by very loosey-goosey legislation from Congress to essentially run the country and to ignore even the president, for whom right, who is allegedly at the top of the executive branch. He's providing the democratic legitimacy and the constitutional legitimacy to everything these agencies do, and that is hard to square with the fact that he doesn't have any control over who's staffing them. Specifically, there are a number of functions in the Department of Education that I think Sotomayor is correct. Like, the Trump administration does not have the power to stop. But the thing is, they're not stopping any of those functions. What they've done is they've moved those functions. Some things like student loans, for example, managing the student loan portfolio. That is something that is very explicitly written out in legislation that has to happen. But that doesn't mean that the president has to have these particular batch of jobs or this particular number of people staffing that program. And in fact, what happened is they moved the portfolio to the Small Business Administration, right? So other people in the government are dealing with that. And I think that is firmly within the president's power. There's some other, moving pieces like that. Bottom line, and I'm happy to, I think just not, you can go backwards and see my case for closing the department and how useless it's been and how little positive effect it's had on American education. This is not a matter of closing schools. This is a matter of managing funds through bureaucratic offices in Washington, D.C., and those funds will flow back to the states essentially without the strings that the bureaucrats place on them. They're not talking about closing schools. But all in all, I think this is a good decision, both on the merits of the case in terms of the legal issues involved. It's a good decision on policy, and it reaffirms, most importantly, the president's ability to arrange the executive branch as he sees fit, and provides one more smackdown to lower courts who think that they have the power to appoint, to reinstate people that the president has fired, reinstate them to power in the executive branch to then go ahead and carry out jobs for the American people. There is no justification for that remedy, even if one agreed with Sotomayor that the Trump administration was out over its skis in terms of the power to reorganize. The remedy of placing people the president has fired back into power is just way beyond what the judicial branch can or should do. So opening it up to the group to comment on any of that. Just one more thing, actually, that I wanted to note. Sotomayor's logic ultimately rests on the idea that the president can't fire so many people that he's effectively repealing legislation unilaterally, right? And I actually agree with that point. The president's duty is to faithfully execute the laws. He can't change what Congress has passed. I actually agree with that. If he were essentially not enforcing the law at all as passed by Congress, then that would be something that I think would go beyond the power of the executive branch. That's not what the Trump administration is doing in this case, and I think that's why this is correctly decided. He does have the power to choose who and how, who is carrying out those programs and how they're carried out. That is very much a part of his duty to faithfully execute. However, I do think that logic applies in a slightly different context, in the state context, to the extent that there are some similarities between state constitutions and the federal one. I think that applies in the context of Soros DAs, who are very, very clearly refusing to enforce laws that are on the books by simply not referring those cases to be worked on for entire categories of law. I think that that's kind of a true argument that Sotomayor is making, and I think it applies to people who are expressly taking that executive power and blowing it up into the ability to simply not enforce laws that they don't like. But that's not what the Trump administration is doing here. So yeah, any part of that, fair game.
So I think it's worth noting in the Trump administration's application, in this case, there was a money line where they said, the Constitution vests the executive branch, not district courts, with the authority to make judgments about how many employees are needed to carry out an agency's statutory functions and whom they should be. And then they conclude in this, what I think is the defining sort of argument here, that the injunction effectively appoints the district court to a cabinet role and bars the executive branch from terminating anyone, even though the other side, respondents, conceded that some other RIFs, reductions in force, would plainly be proper. So I think Inez hit on the key point, which is that the remedies here are so egregious. And we've seen the remedies be egregious in a whole slew of the most radical lower court rulings Of course, remember when it comes to you have to pay out $2 billion in foreign aid funds while the Trump administration is reviewing all the contracts. Same thing, which didn't even belong in a district court. It would belong in a federal claims court probably. But you have the continued overreach from the lower courts. And so one question that I would have for the Supreme Court is, okay, you issued this ruling here without any commentary whatsoever. Is there going to be more vigorous commentary to cut the sails of the lower courts as they continue with the radical moves? Right now, it's basically whack-a-mole, with Scotus taking up some cases and smacking down the lower courts, usually with very tersely worded statements, if there's any statement associated with the decision. But the question is going to be what's going to happen as a deluge of cases like these continue to become before the Supreme Court. And that is kind of my ultimate question also around universal injunctions, de facto universal injunctions that are coming down the pike with nationwide class actions and other ways that you're going to have left-wing plaintiffs working hand in glove with radicals in robes in the lower courts to try and hamstring the administration universally. What is the Supreme Court going to do to curtail the radicalism? And if the Supreme Court isn't up to the task, then is Congress going to do anything? I know that's almost a joke to even think about Congress actually doing something here with respect to the courts, but I still think we go back to the fundamental problem of courts are only as good as the judges who are presiding, and that is the problem ultimately with the lower courts. But all that said, this was a good opinion, rightly smacking down the lower courts. I do think we're going to have very interesting debates on the merits about what can a president do in terms of restructuring agencies. Do they have to use appropriated funds for certain tasks, or can they withhold? We're going to have all manner of fascinating debates on the merits on these. But when it comes down to the lower court radicalism, here the court did the right thing in smacking down the lower court for the extreme remedy in place.
Yeah, I'm glad to see this ruling. I think I'm actually, I guess I'm a lot more positive here. I mean, obviously the lawfare is continuing, but after CASA, I think things have been going really good. It's nice to see that the Supreme Court thought this injunction was so ridiculous that they just put a stay on it without even explaining themselves. They're just like, no, you can't. They can fire who they want to fire in their department. You don't just get to stop that. And it's a bad sign for the remaining, kind of bureaucrats who've been used to just being able to hold on to their cushy jobs. It seems like there's a sea change in both the way the executive branch views things and the way the Supreme Court views things, and that's sufficient to get rid of these people.
Yeah, it's just always mind-boggling to me how the executive, according to these lower court judges, is not in charge of the executive branch, can't even choose his own employees. It's truly incredible stuff and just defies basic logic. But with that, we'll go to Will, who's going to walk us through the DOJ drama surrounding the Epstein files. It has indeed escalated some since we talked about this last week.
That's right. So there's been quite a bit of news on the Epstein front. We have a very, we've had a lot going on here. First off, last Friday, Dan Bongino, in an effort, I think, to essentially get what he wanted, or just out of frustration, apparently didn't show up for work and announced to basically everybody involved that it was either him or Pam Bondi. There's a lot of reporting, not just from the left, but also from our side on this. Did I lose you guys? Are you all frozen? Okay, sorry. You can cut this a little bit. Everybody had like frozen visages. And this is all over the Epstein stuff. And I think, again, we have to remember there was last Friday, the previous Sunday, the administration put out a letter saying that there's not going to be any further Epstein disclosures, that there's not sufficient evidence on which to base a prosecution of third parties, that there's no incriminating list, et cetera. Whatever the truth of that, and I think that's very likely true. I think we discussed this last week, why it's reasonable to trust Dan Bongino about this. I still have to think that, there's a little bit of frustration on his part that he's not used to being constrained in what he can say. This is a guy who's a podcast host. He's used to being able to express himself and be straight and completely transparent with his audience. And when you're employed by the FBI, there's a lot more constraints on what you can say. And I'm sure he's frustrated by that and frustrated by all the hubbub about it. So that drama has led to a whole bunch of other drama over the weekend at Turning Point USA. You had a bunch of people, including Tucker Carlson, speculating that Epstein was in Mossad, asserting it as though it were fact, even though I think the evidence for that is extraordinarily thin. And just generally, I find it kind of the Epstein stuff has really gotten bizarre in the following way. People have gotten willing to make aggressively specific claims about the nature of Epstein's conduct and the relationships he had that are extremely improbable and don't have a lot of evidence behind them. So let me explain. You start with Epstein and you say, okay, what are the odds that Epstein was running like a blackmailing ring? Well, reasonably, there's a reasonable probability of that. Okay, what are the odds that Epstein was running a probability ring, blackmail ring on behalf of a state actor? Well, that's a whole nother degree of independently low probability. And that's a lot less obvious to me because there's a lot of risk that goes involved with state actors being involved with something like that. And then you add another layer of improbability when you say, okay, Epstein was not only running a blackmail ring on behalf of a state actor, but we know exactly who that state actor was. It's Israel. You do? What's the evidence of that? I mean, that's a remarkably improbable proposition because it just layers on each of these specific things, and yet people are claiming it as fact. I think it's honestly a bit of a reaction to the same people who are doing this. So the same people that were claiming that Iran the Iran strikes were going to lead to World War III, and it's sort of like rather than grapple with whatever mistakes in their perception of reality might have led them to make a bad prediction like that, they're just kind of jumping on to the next thing to try and somehow, you stay not relevant isn't the right word, but just sort of stay on top of Israel, and sort of have their general world anti-Israel worldview vindicated. And so if it can't be vindicated by our support of Israel or our engaging in the strike led to World War III, maybe it's vindicated by, well, actually, we're supporting this country that is running a child pornography and child trafficking ring. But there's not any evidence of that. Naftali Bennett put out a statement to that effect. And it just strikes me as improbable. As someone who's actually read a decent amount about Mossad and espionage operations, the Epstein thing is very much out of character for the way Mossad normally operates. They're much less obvious than that and much more sophisticated. If you're trying to look for evidence of that, you can look for the fact that they managed to find and identify and kill basically every member of the Iranian high command. That's a function of intelligence. So I don't, the idea that an organization capable of doing that would then run this extraordinarily sloppy, blackmailing campaign to what end with a pedophile? I don't know. It just doesn't strike me as probable. But and obviously this has been dominating the news cycle of late. I think that one thing that is clear is that Trump has had enough of it. All this talk about Bongino trying to go after Pambani and saying it's me or him. I don't think he was very impressed by that ultimatum, and it's a good thing that Dan Bongino showed up on Monday, and I think the temperature is coming down.
I mean, I don't need to repeat everything I said last time. I know that people vehemently disagree with me on this, and I understand why to some extent, because God knows we've all had so much reason to mistrust our institutions and government for so long. But this just doesn't strike me as particularly plausible for all the reasons Will laid out, but also because, it kind of assumes that rich and famous people don't talk to each other. I don't think you could continue to work your way through a list of people who all know each other endlessly as a blackmailer. I think at some point the memo would go out, don't go to this island, you're going to get blackmailed. That's not to say that, this isn't a heinous crime, and there probably are people who are going to get away with it, but I'm deeply uncomfortable, for example, with the idea of releasing a list. It's not like the whatever list exists is not going to be written down in a ledger. This person committed this crime with underage girls. It's going to be essentially a contacts list, right? And so anybody that this guy has ever had contact with, and we know that he explicitly cultivated contact and party invitations and stuff with all kinds of people, many of them very prominent. I don't know. I think there's a due process problem with just releasing a list like that unredacted when you have no evidence. If there's evidence of a crime, if there's evidence to back up the assertion that some of the people that had contact with him also committed these crimes, then sure, go ahead, prosecute. I'd love to see that. People certainly should be brought to justice for what they did, but I don't like the idea of just releasing something into the public with the insinuation that everybody who's in Jeffrey Epstein's little black book or whatever is a pedophile. That also seems like a very Kavanaugh-esque kind of situation to me that I don't think is really legitimate. And I imagine that is probably what goes into a lot of these decisions, to not fully release, for example, all of the files on this matter. I don't have any objection to appointing a special special counsel. I just, I'm glad that seems to be dying down a little bit because I think there are so many more important matters. And I guess the reason I think there are so many more important matters is because I don't find the sort of higher order, story about what was really going on here to be plausible. I think this is more likely to be, something that is disgusting and heinous, but for whom it probably doesn't have those larger echelon consequences for governance or corruption that a lot of people seem to think it does.
Yeah, I think what bothers people the most about this there's two things. The first is that even if, as I said last week, this isn't going to be like some fairy tale where everything is perfectly wrapped up in a bow and every single person who Epstein and Maxwell were trafficking victims to gets prosecuted. I think it really strikes people as odd that they haven't prosecuted anyone outside of those two individuals for being involved in the human trafficking, child trafficking ring. And I don't think it's out of pocket to say that it stretches credulity a bit to say that the FBI completed its investigation and wasn't able to find one client of Epstein's with enough evidence to prosecute. And that's where people's brains start saying, okay, something is kind of off here. And I don't know what the off is, whether it's intelligence or a cover up, or maybe files were destroyed prior to Trump taking office. I mean, who knows what the actual reason is, but I understand why people are confused and concerned. And it didn't help, this is part two, that there were some major missteps by the administration in the memo that was eventually released. The FBI apparently completed its investigation back in April, which I think is part of the reason why Bongino issued that ultimatum and was so upset, because he felt like the FBI did its job. They were ready to be honest with the American people if it is the case that they didn't have enough evidence to get any of the clients. And it was dragged out by the Department of Justice and Pam Bondi, giving those phase one binders to the influencers, saying on TV that she had the client list when she apparently just had random Epstein documents on her desk that she hadn't even looked at yet. Whether that was a lie or a misstatement or her just being kind of stupid, I mean, it doesn't really matter. You misled the public essentially. So those DOJ missteps combined with we weren't able to get anyone is why people are so skeptical about the administration's official narrative.
I think the other skepticism part, or I think the part that just leaves the impression that there's something not right here. And when you set aside for a moment the Epstein got a sweetheart deal, and then Epstein somehow is able to kill himself supposedly in federal custody, and all of these powerful people left unscathed heretofore, and then setting aside the messaging of the administration is, all of these powerful people seemingly had something to gain by whatever is in federal authorities' hands being suppressed. So, who did someone call a shot to ensure that that information remained suppressed? And maybe this is not an issue. Maybe this is a total non-issue if there hadn't been representations that there was something there, that there were going to be these big disclosures. But once you make the assertion that there is something there, and then the main takeaway is, well, there's actually no there. People have lost their trust in the institutions, and people naturally jump to the conclusion, I think, now that the deep state wants things buried, and it gets those things buried. So that's all a way of saying I don't have a view one way or the other as to what's there and what the true story is. I do have questions, and Occam's razor maybe answers them, about how did this guy who was a teacher at Dalton end up managing purportedly hundreds of millions or billions of dollars with no particular expertise, and then obviously is able to compile compromise on lots of people? To what end? Was he working for anyone or not? We're going to have conspiracizing about this forever. But I will say that on the glomming that onto, then he's a Mossad agent. I think you have to judge every person in terms of what the claims they make are, based upon the full factual record of their claims, to assess whether or not they're operating in bad faith or good faith. But a substantial percentage of the people who are making this jump to he's a Mossad agent, I think are clearly trafficking in classic Jew-hating tropes. And I think it ought to be said, it's contemptible when any single time you can find a Jewish person who is affiliated with some other Jewish people, that there's always a cabal behind them working towards these nefarious ends. It's classic anti-Semitism here. This isn't about silencing people or shutting people up or saying that people shouldn't go down whatever rabbit hole they want to go down based upon what the actual facts and evidence suggest. But to Will's point, there's almost no discussion of why are you making that claim? Show us the facts. Should connect the dots for us. And that speaks to, I think, something really rotten and disgusting that has happened post October 7th. And it's really a shame that a percentage of people who I think are much louder than they are influential, who were on our side, so-called, are going down that rabbit hole. It's disgusting and it's offensive, and I think it ought to be said.
All right, back to me for the rescissions package that is now in the Senate. The House passed a $9.4 billion rescissions package earlier this, or I guess late last week or early this week. But in any case, it's now up for the Senate, which it only needs 51 votes to pass. That's sort of the beauty of rescissions, is you claw back money that's already been appropriated by Congress. You only need 51 votes to do it. You don't need the normal 60 in a full spending process. And this includes the defunding of NPR, PBS, other government-controlled or government-funded media outlets. And a lot of people on the House side are referring to this as basically the bare minimum. It accounts for less than 1% of the total budget that they're trying to get rid of. Senate Majority Leader John Thune has said that he looks forward to bringing this up for consideration, but there's some signaling that this is going to face resistance from naturally the more moderate establishment senators, most notably in Alaska, Murkowski and Sullivan, who are making the argument that farmers can't get the weather unless they have access to PBS. So this is not going to be an easy fight, I think, for Thune and some of the more conservative senators, but it should be, right? This is, again, a drop in the bucket of total spending. It only attacks the most aggressively woke types of spending that were approved in the last administration, plus the defunding of PBS and NPR, which have gone woefully left-wing in the past 10, 15 years. And it just seems like an obvious win for Republicans, which means that they will probably screw it up at the 11th hour. I've talked to some sources on the Hill last week who indicated that this was basically the first test to see if the president can get this rescissions package done. If it goes through successfully, then they will start sending even more rescissions packages where they start to expand the net of programs that they want to get rid of, things that they want to defund. But this is supposed to be like everything in this $9.4 billion is obviously crazy and we should get rid of it. And if the Senate can't pass that, then we know that it's not worth our time to put together another package to send their way. So I am curious on the group's thoughts on whether or not you think the Senate will get this done. If there are things that might be stripped out of the rescissions package in order to satisfy some of those moderate senators. Of course, during the process with the big, beautiful bill, we saw Murkowski get a huge kickback for Alaska, getting to basically avoid some of those cuts to the state reimbursement program for Medicaid. Because she was the final vote that they needed to get to the tie for J.D. Vance to break the tie. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to throw her a bone here as well. But in this case, they might not have to because they would have Rand Paul presumably voting in favor, whereas on the big, beautiful bill, he decided to opt out. So to the group, do you think this will pass? And if it does, what comes next? Will the next rescissions package that the White House sends them farewell also, or is this maybe the end of the road for the spending cuts? Because, I mean, realistically, if this doesn't get done, the idea that in a full budgetary process that they would get major cuts doesn't seem very likely.
I guess maybe a somewhat contrarian take. I cared a lot more about this when Elon Musk was still on side, when he was still part of the team, when he was in the cabinet. I was like, he's working hard. He's making a lot of sacrifices to be on the team. This is something he really cares about. He's worked really hard in it. It's like, and in general, yeah, I mean, the things we're spending money on are kind of silly, and we should cut the spending. But it's not a huge amount of spending overall, but it's a sign of good faith to Elon when he was in the cabinet and a part of the team. Now, the guy decided to go full on rebellion against the Republican Party. He's going to start a new party. Told Trump that he was in the Epstein files, like just kind of, a whole bunch of stuff that made clear he's no longer in the camp. It's like, okay, well then, what the impetus for this is sort of a, I mean, it's a good idea to cut spending on things we don't need. Yes. Is this the most important thing facing our country? No. I went from actually caring that this got done quite a bit to keep as a matter of keeping up relations within the coalition, and especially among, in particular, specific to Elon. Now I don't really care so much about it. Although I do think, I mean, obviously on net we should do it. Cutting spending is good when it comes to cutting spending on the NPR is better. But I'm not gonna get super upset if we can't get it done.
I will be upset if we can't get it done, because not because I am so much of a budgetary hawk, but because there's some good content in this. I think that's how we ought to think about spending, and particularly how we ought to message spending cuts. Is not the saving of dollars and cents, although that is important, but whether or not this cuts things that are actively harming the country. And I think this bill is full of those things. Amber pointed out NPR. And also, I'm just not feeling very friendly to our local moderate Senate cohort, because in the last fight for the big, beautiful bill, they, at the very last second, dropped my big, beautiful endowment tax on university endowments from 21% to a mere 8% for the highest tier. And those would be Senators Tillis, Todd Young from Indiana, and Langford from Oklahoma. And they are very much the part of that moderate Senate cohort. But I think this it speaks to the problem that these people are. First of all, I understand like the political necessity of having moderates in states that are moderate, right? Or states that are blue, where you have a Republican senator elected from a state that is not like deep red. I get that. But why do we have problems with people elected from Oklahoma? Like, why is it that we can't get basic conservative stuff through representatives who are coming from deep red states half the time? It is a major problem. It's a major part of the reason that there have been successive populist rebellions in the Republican Party, starting with the Tea Party, at least in my political lifetime, the Tea Party, and then, the Trump rebellion against the party establishment. That's a huge part of it, is that, I think the American people are reasonable. We understand the idea that if somebody was elected from, a swing state, right? Even something like North Carolina, which is a red state, but like is more purple, right? Where Tom Tillis is from. I think we would understand that a lot better. But it just seems to become an excuse to say no to the actual conservative agenda that most of these people run on when they go home to their deep red states, and ask the voters to support them for another 6 years. So, I mean, my patience for that is very low. So I'm with Amber, and I think not only this will be a good barometer, and if it goes well, then hopefully a good sign of things to come. I'm not sure what's going to happen, of whether that's going to happen or not. Totally, up for granted, especially up for, kind of a free for all, because especially given, and not just the one I just listed, there were a bunch of things that happened on the big, beautiful bill in the very last 24 hours to appease exactly this corner of the Senate. And so I don't know, that makes me pretty cynical about efforts going forward.
Well, I think on a broader point, we could probably have many episodes long conversation about why Republicans don't do what they say they're going to do once they're in office. But I think in part, a simple answer is that a lot of these people are controlled opposition at the end of the day. They don't actually really care so much about the conservative principles that they use to get elected. They care about power, prestige, jobs for family and friends, et cetera. It's obviously a very cynical way to look at it, but I also think it's probably the honest way, and it explains a lot of why people operate the way they do, beyond obviously all of the myriad pressures that you have from the interest groups and from legacy media, and then from your colleagues, and then from leadership. And leadership itself is naturally not going to be as strident, probably, and ideological in its views. And if you want to ever rise up to gavel, powerful committee, well, you better play ball. So for all those different reasons, some of them are ideological and some of them are structural and purely political. There are a lot of reasons why people don't govern the way they say they're going to govern. But all that said, and this is reflected in the fact that we're talking about a $9 billion rescissions package, not a $90 billion rescissions package or a $900 billion rescissions package, which is unimaginable on today's terms. I do think ultimately, though, if the voters wanted there to be much larger rescissions packages, then ultimately politicians do have to be responsive to their constituents. We haven't seen the rebellion to the spending really since the Tea Party. And I do think it is important to frame it as they're lighting your dollars on fire in ways that do great damage to the things you care most about. And why would you trust these people to shepherd your dollars with any modicum of care or prudence when you see what they do on a whole slew of consequential issues? Shouldn't it be left to you? And shouldn't they stop robbing you, your children, and your children's children, and getting us in debt to all these adversarial powers, et cetera, et cetera? But it doesn't seem like the public feels a need to revolt. And so that's how you end up with a $9 billion rescissions package that may or may not pass with a putatively Republican-controlled Senate. I do think this is a proxy issue. I think it's more symbolically significant than substantively on the $9 billion. It would be great if this could be the first of a whole slew of rescissions packages that actually add up to a substantial dollar figure and also qualitatively make a difference in the way of doing no harm with spending. But I think the jury is out on the Senate side of things. The House has worked much more I think smoothly and in lockstep with the administration. It's on the Senate and Senate leadership to prove that it's actually going to do what the administration wants here on a package that I think is really driven by OMB, which is sort of the beating heart of the Trump administration's policy world.
And right back to you, Ben, for a breakdown of the latest Biden autopen revelations.
Yeah, so on an entirely different topic, but a worthy topic, I think, Joe Biden saw fit to do a 10-minute interview with the New York Times, which I think was the first interview that he did with the Times since 2021. And what's really interesting, setting aside what Joe Biden maintained and what the Times reported, is that Team Biden felt it incumbent upon itself to connect with the Times, to have Joe Biden available, and to try and frame the story about the usage of the autopen the way they wanted it. The Times also was able to obtain a slew of email traffic around some of the clemency decisions, which represents a fraction of what lawmakers and other investigators are looking at right now in terms of autopen usage and decision-making around clemency and pardons. But where did they get that tranche, and who wanted them to see what they saw, and what did they portray? I think those are all major questions, and I think the big takeaway is that Team Biden felt the need to get out in front of whatever investigators are going to find. They wanted to frame their story. They also wanted to frame their story before a slew of Biden aides go in front of congressional investigators and others to testify about the autopen usage. And I don't think they would have done this. I don't think that they would have tried to set the narrative and put out their version of events. And the Times version of events should probably be viewed as the most favorable to Team Biden. I don't think they would have done it unless they were concerned about what's coming down the pike. So I think that is notable before we get into the specifics. And I think one of the big specifics in terms of the takeaways of this Times piece and the interview they did with Joe Biden separately, which appears to have been a train wreck, even in the way that the New York Times edited it, is the piece, kind of the headline of the piece is Joe Biden saying, "I made every decision," quote unquote. But then later on, the New York Times writes, Mr. Biden did not individually approve each name for the categorical pardons that applied to large numbers of people. He and aides confirmed. Rather, after extensive discussion of different possible criteria, he signed off on the standards he wanted to be used to determine which convicts would qualify for a reduction in sentence. And the Times basically goes through the chain of command and how decisions purportedly flowed ostensibly from Joe Biden to the people who were actually running the whole pardon process. And what they say is essentially that there were these blurbs written, so-called, where Joe Biden gave oral commands to one person who then reports it to other people who then sign off and actually use the autopen. The person using the autopen was not in the room with Joe Biden when Joe Biden said, give this person clemency, pardon this individual. There's also an interesting aspect of this, which is that you have senior members of his staff in some cases giving the final sign-off, confirming that Joe Biden gave sign-off and decisions. And then you also see in the article that Joe Biden's involvement in those decisions, at least his side wants to emphasize, he was directly involved in having conversations when it came to the Mark Millies of the world, the J6 investigator types, and then, of course, Biden family members with the preemptive pardons, that he was integrally involved in those decisions. But he was much more sort of aloof and not involved when it came to the sort of mass commutations and such when it came to the convict. So he dealt with different pardon decisions differently in terms of his involvement, is the story that they're putting forth. I don't think that this does anything to put a pin in our skepticism about whether he was there mentally and then whether he was actually making decisions, who was authorized to make decisions on what grounds with respect to the pardons, which I do think represents about something approximating the apex of presidential power here. The other question then becomes, was there a conspiracy to cover up the mental state and then for this cabal essentially to actually be responsible for these hugely consequential decisions? But then does any of this matter until and unless A, obviously people lie under oath potentially, or B, you have a legal challenge to a pardon or a decision where the Trump administration tries to prosecute someone, or there's a reversal of a policy down the road, and then it gets challenged in court, and then you have discovery. Is this justiciable or not? I think it has to be justiciable whether a pardon was legitimately made and the president authorized it or not. I don't know that we get anywhere until there actually is a challenge and there is discovery and testimony in a court of law. But I'm curious what you all think. What do you make of the significance of him going to the New York Times and giving his version of events and the New York Times trying to get out in front of this? And do you think any of these investigations lead anywhere?
Yeah, I'll just speak to the New York Times interview. I definitely do not think it was as beneficial to his pleas as Biden thought it was going to be, or his team thought it was going to be, which is normally the case when Biden speaks to the press, to be honest. But all this did was confirm that there was no real paper trail of the final sign off on these pardons. There was basically a third order game of telephone where advisors met with Biden. He allegedly confirmed verbally that he wanted to issue the pardons or sign the EOs. They then relayed that to aides who were not in the room, who typed them out, sent them to the staff secretary, who sent them along to the DOJ without any final sign off from the president. And in one of the cases, the pardon was apparently determined at 10 o'clock at night. I think a lot of people would struggle to think that Biden was up at 10 o'clock the night before the inauguration, telling his staff to sign pardons, when this was a guy who was frequently calling 3-hour brunch lids and whose day typically ended by 3 or 4 p.m. on his average workday in the White House. And then we also have to believe that after he verbally told staff to issue these pardons at 10 p.m., that throughout the whole process, where it gets back to Jeff Zients to give the final approval, that Biden was up till almost 11 p.m. to give the final sign off to Zients, who then sent it along to the aides who continued this process. I mean, all of it is so sketchy, to say the least, but for anyone who has any idea of how Biden's schedule was at the time that he was serving as president, it doesn't seem very likely that he was actually awake at that hour. And if he was awake, he probably wasn't very cogent. So the whole thing is very strange. There's obviously a lot of unanswered questions about this. In response to the House Oversight investigation, who has subpoenaed multiple members of the Biden White House about this, NBC News ran an article today comparing the autopen issue to Oversight Chairman James Comer using a digital signature to issue the subpoenas in this investigation, as if they're at all comparable. The idea of a president pardoning someone with no paper trail to prove that he actually approved the pardons or was aware of them, versus someone using DocuSign to get out a subpoena that he has said publicly 3 times in an official statements that he was going to do. The Oversight Committee actually responded to the NBC News article with a funny Photoshop of the reporter in this instance in clown paint, face paint makeup, and kind of took him to task for the ridiculousness of the article. But yeah, I think the New York Times article actually opens up more than shutting down the accusations or even the skepticism about how the autopen was being operated by White House staff.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, and by this, I don't mean specifically the autopen scandal, but the condition of the president and the extreme likelihood that he was not able to be mentally competent to perform the function of the president is obviously among the greatest scandals in American history. I'm a little bit skeptical that this is going to really result in much other than horror at the way that the White House operated for 4 years. Potentially, I could see if there is a productive route legally here, I would think it would be some of the things that are suggested by Comer and some of the House Republicans, which are going after staffers, right? Which until we get somebody basically to squeal under oath, I could see some prosecutions of staffers for essentially misuse of government power. I can't really see a route, and I totally could be wrong, because as far as I know, this is the first time. This is an issue of first impression. This has never happened in American history before. So it's about finding the right analogy that fits into our legal structures. My gut, though, says this is a political question, and the remedies ought to be political, right? In other words, that there are essentially 3 political remedies against the president being incapacitated. There's the 25th Amendment, which was not invoked, right, by his own cabinet. There's impeachment, which didn't happen. And then there's the ultimate removal of the president through elections. Those are political remedies. I kind of do think it's non-justiciable issue. But I mean, I'd be happy to be wrong. It's certainly a massive scandal, but the difference between going after a staffer and like punishing somebody who illegitimately used presidential power is a different remedy than like overturning all of the things that Biden did with this autopen. I think that's probably a lot less legit and likely. I'd be happy to be wrong. Maybe somebody can dig up some cases in the comments or something, but that's what my gut says. I will say there is a problem with these mass pardons, and maybe that is something that we maybe should think about. Congress should think about limiting it would take a constitutional amendment. But the fact that there were these mass pardons, and then like the president wasn't actually individually approving every single one of the pardons, he was just approving a category of people. So even forgetting about Biden being, having dementia and being out of it, right? The president appears did not give like final approval to some of the names that were on the list. It was not like he went person by person. He's approving an entire category of offenders. And to me, that even though I don't think that there's really a way to rein it in without an amendment, to me that is an abuse of the spirit of the pardon power, which is kind of a royal prerogative type power, as was criticized at the time in the founding. But to be able to issue it for entire categories of prisoners rather than individuals seems to me to be at least an abuse in spirit.
Yeah, I have your similar suspicion that nothing is going to end up coming of this in terms of like reversing the pardons. I don't think it's justiciable for the same reason you do. It's just there's no judicial review of pardons, and as long as Biden's willing to put an affidavit into the record that says I pardon these people, that'll probably be the end of it. It is just a reflection of maybe we shouldn't have senile presidents. Maybe the people who are responsible for hiding the president's decline are I want to see the staffers gone after for the same reason that others have highlighted. They deserve it. If they don't deserve it for hiding the president's decline from the American people, they certainly deserve it for frivolously using the pardon power and generally abusing the presidency.
All right, then moving to final thoughts. Mine will be just briefly an update on this case that happened about 2 years ago. There was a defund the police, abolish prisons activist who was stabbed to death by what appeared to be a crazy homeless man on the streets of New York City. And it was sort of like a perfect case study of the left overriding the human instinct for self-preservation. This guy starts kicking over scooters. The guy and his girlfriend start walking his direction for some reason and getting closer to him as he's having this like weird violent meltdown, and then tries to reason with the guy as he starts advancing on him, and tragically was stabbed to death. His girlfriend just posted a photo this week with Zohran Mamdani referring to him as her mayor, which is amazing, of course, because Mamdani also called for defunding the police. And so now her and all of her left-wing activist friends are justifying why she watched her boyfriend die in front of her, but still thinks that being against basic public safety measures is a good idea. It's just really wild stuff. Something that I personally can't comprehend, but I think, the leftist ideology in many ways requires you to elevate questions of diversity and equity over like basic means of self-defense and self-preservation, and that brain rot really is quite sad to witness in real time. She's obviously traumatized too, I'm sure, but it doesn't really justify the support of someone who would enact policies that would make it easier for people to end up with the same fate like her boyfriend did.
Yeah, my final thought is about JD Vance, who stayed a little bit out of the spotlight as of recently, but he was thrust back into it by a viral video of him doing what has now been labeled the dad shuffle after one of his kids in Disneyland. And it was just like a really interesting divide online because, of course, there were a lot of people making fun of him because he does this sort of awkward running where he's kind of half running and half not. And then a lot of people, especially people who have kids, immediately identified what he was doing, which is like not wanting to alarm the kids, like trying to, catch an animal that is like spooking, right? You don't want them to run off, or you're not quite certain that what they're doing needs intervention, but like it might need intervention. So you got to get there and you kind of have to awkwardly hustle. Anyway, everybody immediately recognized what he was doing, except for a contingent of, I would say, a combination of like ideological leftists and people who are not familiar with children. For a variety of reasons, but I thought it was funny and worth mentioning. Another sort of, I guess that was the funny part of the final thoughts for me. The negative part was just another embarrassment. The former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul from the previous administration, some of these rifts, these reductions in force, have hit USAID, have hit the State Department, right, where he was previously part of. And so he posted on Twitter that he cried when he saw, and there's all these like ridiculous theater kid antics and all of these layoffs, right? There's like people in the State Department posting coup threats on the walls as they leave, and having cry out sessions in front of the State Department. But to have the ambassador to Russia basically say, oh, he's crying over these layoffs in the State Department. I mean, no wonder Putin wouldn't take him or us seriously, right? It's just like another note in embarrassment that the quote unquote adults in the room are anything but.
My final thought is on last Sunday, marking 1 year since the Butler assassination attempt on Donald Trump, a moment that I think probably for millions of Americans is one where you'll remember where you were and what you were doing at the time it transpired. I think the moment itself, reflecting on it, on the one hand, I think all of us felt rage and deep sadness at what transpired, but then there was also Trump himself then standing defiant and pumping his fist, and there's not a more American or iconic sort of response that one can have, a more authentic response that one could have in such a moment than that. And of course, this was the culmination of the impeachment efforts, Russiagate, the lawfare efforts, etc. They tried to do everything they could to destroy him, and ultimately it made him that much stronger. This will be looked at as a very American, uniquely American story, I think, in the annals of history, generations from now. By the same token, we're looking at continued postmortems a year on, showing all of the catastrophic failures that led up to a bullet coming within millimeters of the president's brain. And it's remarkable what those gaps and vulnerabilities were. Some of these revelations came out in a recent report that Senator Chuck Grassley's office pushed out via the GAO, which talks about the fact there was intelligence about a threat 10 days before Butler, and it was not communicated to the right officials. There were so many breakdowns in terms of communications, chain of command, not having competent people on the ground, not having the right resources, assets not functioning properly, et cetera. And maybe even more scary and enraging is the fact that some of these gaps and vulnerabilities continue to persist, at least according to the GAO. So the question is, could a Butler happen again? And the answer has to be no. And it's not clear at this point that that is the case. I would also point everyone to check out my colleague at Real Clear, Susan Crabtree's reporting on the issue of the sloped roof and why the sloped roof wasn't adequately defended. There continues to be lack of clarity about why this transpired and who made the final call, essentially, not to properly defend it. It's a story that you ought to read. It'll make you tear your hair out, but it's very representative, I think, of the issues we face, including in the national security bureaucracy. And the last point I'll make is that it's clear that we are a country that is blessed by God. That's the only reason that Donald Trump survived that day and we are where we are today. And we should thank our lucky stars for that.
Yeah, my final thought is there's a very interesting court case down in the the Central District of California in Los Angeles, where Judge Mwame Frimpong, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her that's not even her full name, is ruled in an immigration case and put an injunction on the Department of Homeland Security saying that they were not allowed to, they had to follow the law on the Fourth Amendment. You're not allowed, first off, you're not allowed to have an injunction that simply orders people to follow the law, but then tried to say that they're not allowed to make stops of people they think are illegal immigrants based on any combination of race, where they're being picked up at like a Home Depot, the language they're speaking and what they're doing. She basically trying to completely throw out Fourth Amendment jurisprudence and spit in the face of the Supreme Court's ruling in Casa Inc. And then the DOJ actually has filed a notice of appeal, and we're like, we're appealing this. This injunction is unlawful in a slew of different ways. And she just put out a minute order saying people need to brief whether or not they can even appeal this injunction because I named it a temporary restraining order. This woman is a clown, has no business being on the bench, and just yet another one of these awful Biden judges whose understanding of the law is akin to somebody who hasn't even finished a semester of law school. So hopefully this person gets reversed, and we're eventually going to have to do something about these idiot judges.
All right, that's going to do it for us this week. As a reminder, register for the annual National Conservatism Conference September 2nd to 4th. You can register at nationalconservatism.org. On behalf of Will, Inez, and Ben, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.